Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my mini lecture on the 12 types of connective tissue. All right, as you recall, there are four main tissue types in the human body. Epithelial tissues are tightly packed cells that either form membranes that surround or line the parts of the body, or they form glands that secrete things. Connective tissues, just a moment. Muscular tissues consist of cells that can shorten themselves and therefore can cause action to happen. They're what we call a functional tissue. So muscular tissues can adjust the size of an organ, or they can cause a body part to move, or they can, in the case of cardiac muscle, pump blood through your heart. Okay. Finally, nervous tissues collect sensory information and carry it into the central nervous system, where it is processed and decisions are made, and then commands are carried. The nervous tissues carry commands back out to muscular tissues, glandular tissues, other tissues that need to be told what to do. Connective tissues then are sort of a catch-all category for tissues that aren't epithelial, muscular, or nervous. So what do connective tissues have in common? Well, that's a little bit difficult to say, because for just about any rule you make about connective tissues, you're going to find exceptions. They mostly don't have a lot of cells, but then there are a couple that do. They mostly have a lot of extracellular matrix, but then there are a few that don't. They mostly have a lot of blood vessels, but there are a few that don't. So what I'm going to do, the best way to introduce the connective tissues is to just introduce them. I'm going to walk through the categories of connective tissues and then ultimately introduce you to all 12 of the connective tissues that we're going to learn in this class. Okay, so as you know, anatomists love to categorize things. Connective tissues can be categorized into connective tissue proper, which is the tissue that most properly fits the definition of a connective tissue. They might physically connect two things, like a ligament connects two bones, or they might just fill in space between two other tissues. Supportive tissues are tissues that can support your weight. So these are the skeletal tissues, cartilage and bone. And then fluid tissues, of course, are the tissues that are actually made of fluid. For example, blood. And you can think of blood as a connective tissue in that as blood travels from one organ to another, it is sort of connecting the two. Okay. So let's introduce the connective tissues proper. We again have two categories, loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Again, as I've said, anatomists love to categorize things. So what is it that makes a tissue loose or dense? Loose connective tissues have mostly cells plus ground substance, okay? Whereas dense connective tissues are denser. They are mostly protein fibers, okay? So our loose connective tissues are going to be looser. They're going to have more soft stuff like cells and ground substance. Dense connective tissues are going to have more of the hard, rigid protein fiber stuff. Okay. The first of the loose connective tissues is called areolar. Okay, and this comes from the root word area, meaning an areolar tissue is one that surrounds another tissue, perhaps the area underneath the basal surface of a epithelial tissue, or the tissue around a muscular tissue. No connection to the body part called the areola. That's just a coincidence. In areolar tissues, you're going to find kind of a hodgepodge of different things. You'll find, here's a collagen fiber there. Here's a collagen fiber there. Maybe here's a collagen fiber here. You'll also find some of the purple squiggly fibers that are our elastic fibers, because areolar tissues often need a little bit of stretch to them. And then you'll find some cells, okay? These are going to be different cells than perhaps you're used to. They're not necessarily perfect round little cells. One type you'll find in all of the connective tissues proper is a cell called a fibroblast. Fibroblast builder. This is a cell that wanders around your connective tissues, rebuilding damaged fibers. The other cell you'll see here is a mast cell. These cells are early warning cells of the immune system that when they notice an infection process beginning to happen, they sound an alarm and cause a result called inflammation that brings in the troops. Okay. Next, we find adipose loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue is mostly composed of these large circular cells. In fact, it sort of looks like bubble wrap in a way, called adipocytes. Okay. In and among the adipocytes, you'll find some reticular fibers, which really look kind of brown. I don't have a brown ink on this drawing program here, so I'll use orange instead. And every now and then you'll also see a little bit of a blood vessel here, because adipose tissue has a significant blood supply to get the nutrients into the adipose tissue that the adipocytes can store as fat. And also later on, when you need that energy, to get that energy out of the adipocytes back into your blood so that your body can use it. Adipose tissue is found in places where your body needs to store energy. So, your abdominal cavity often has a lot of adipose fat, but it's also found around a lot of your organs as a shock absorber. So around the heart and the kidneys and the spinal cord, because adipose tissue is a very sturdy, shock absorbing kind of tissue. And it's also found in your subcutaneous layer as an insulator to help retain body heat. All right, and then we have the reticular loose connective tissue. Each of these tissues, by the way, in the loose connective tissue could be called, the name I've given you here plus loose connective tissue, or you can just drop the loose connective and call it areolar tissue, adipose tissue, reticular tissue. However you like to do that. Reticular fibers are obviously the main feature of this tissue. You have these branching reticular fibers, and then they're decorated with large numbers of cells, often to the point where you can't really see the reticular fibers themselves very much because of all of the cells that cover them. The reticular tissue has often been compared to sort of a grapevine, with the reticular fibers as the vine and the cells as the grapes. A reticular tissue, or reticular loose connective tissue, is found in the stroma of a lot of organs that have to hold on to a lot of loosely organized cells. So the liver, where it has to hold on to a bunch of hepatocytes, the spleen and lymph nodes that have to hold on to a lot of immune cells. Okay. What about our dense connective tissues? So we have three possibilities. We have dense regular, we have dense irregular, and we have dense elastic. And what changes about these, they are all dense, but what fibers they have and how those fibers are organized is what changes. In a dense regular tissue, you've got, okay, here's a collagen fiber, here's another collagen fiber right next to it, and another collagen fiber right next to it. Often there's a little wave to them as they go, but dense collections of these fibers fill up those tissues, and they're arranged in a sort of regular pattern. Every now and then you'll see a nucleus of a fibroblast stuck in there. Dense regular tissues are strong in one direction. Okay, remember collagen fibers are strong in tension. So this is going to be strong in the pulling, in one pulling direction. So these are useful for tissues that have to bear a lot of tension in one direction, like a tendon or a ligament. Dense irregular tissues, on the other hand, solve the problem of what if I'm going to get pulled in lots of different directions, like the dermis of the skin or a fibrous capsule around a joint. In this case, we have collagen fibers arranged in multiple directions, kind of irregularly, as the name suggests, scattered among each other here and there. Okay, but still, mostly what we see is collagen fibers. They're just irregularly scattered. Okay, and you can see how this allows you to pull in lots of different directions and have some strength in every direction. Finally, a dense elastic tissue has these squiggly elastic fibers as the major fiber that you see in that tissue. Okay, these are not going to be as strong in tension, but they're going to be very stretchable, and when they stretch, they will snap back to their original shape. That's what elastic fibers do. They're the rubber bands of the body. Okay, so those are your 6 connective tissues proper. What about your supportive tissues? Here we have a division into cartilages and bone tissues. Again, what's the difference here? Cartilages have a semi-solid matrix Bone tissues have a very solid matrix made out of calcium phosphate or apatite crystals. Okay, what do we see when we look at a cartilage? We see maybe a little bit of membrane on either side. That's the perichondrium. And then basically we see a scattering of light pink. I don't have a light pink color, sorry. Light pink a scattering of light pink matrix all over the cartilage. What makes the cartilage stand out, though, is that you've got these spaces in the cartilage, okay, where cells called chondrocytes can live. Okay, and you will look in those and you'll see little cells filling up those spaces. Okay, so the basic type of cartilage is called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline means glass, so this is a glassy cartilage. If you were to hold up a piece of hyaline cartilage, it would look sort of like frosted bathroom glass that you can't quite see through, but it has that glassy appearance. And so you have this semi-solid matrix throughout here with these circles. The circles are called lacunae, lacuna singular, from the same word root as lagoon. And then the cells are called chondrocytes. Okay. The next type of cartilage, and hyaline cartilage is mostly all a very thick, slightly collagenous ground substance. There's another type of tissue which has, again, those lacunae. This tissue usually stains a blue color for the ground substance. We stain the ground substance a blue color to make the bright pink collagen fibers that we find in this stand out. Okay, and that those bright red collagen fibers make this called fibrous or fibrocartilage. Okay, and so these bright red collagen fibers make it a thicker, sturdier tissue, but they also make it a little less flexible. So fibrous cartilage is found in places where you need more sturdiness and strength. The meniscus of the knee, the intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, places that have a lot of impact to them where you need a very sturdy cartilage. And then finally, we have one more kind of cartilage that, again, has this pattern of lacunae with chondrocytes in them. Okay, but this time we see little purple squiggle fibers running, usually all running in mostly one direction around the lacunae. Okay, those are elastic fibers, and so the name of this tissue is elastic cartilage. Sorry, I should have labeled these. These are collagen fibers. Okay, so those are your three types of cartilage tissue. Elastic cartilage, interestingly enough, is only found in two places in the body. It's found in your earlobe, because our ancestors who were able to flick their ears back and forth needed a sort of flexible but elastic tissue for that. And it's found in the epiglottis, a piece of your larynx that flops down to allow you to swallow food, but then has to spring back up immediately so that you can breathe again. Okay, finally, bone tissues. Bone tissues come in two kinds. There is, your textbook will not tell you this, but there are two kinds of bone tissue: compact bone and spongy bone. If you look at the histology chapter in your textbook, it will just tell you that there is bone tissue or osseous tissue, and it will show you a picture of compact bone. But that's not the only kind of bone you have, and I think it's worth telling you that you've got more than one kind. Okay, so compact bone tissue has these things called osteons that look for all the world like tree ring structures. Okay, makes it a very distinctive tissue, very easy to recognize. And along those, if you look very carefully, there are places where you can see lacunae with, this time not chondrocytes, but it's bone, osteocytes. Okay. We'll spend much more detail on looking at the structure of compact bone in a future lecture on the skeletal tissues in detail, so I'm going to leave my description of compact bone at that for right now. Okay. Spongy bone has these little spikes of pink stained tissue that stick out into empty space here, and they're surrounded by lots of blood cells, or rather bone marrow cells, blood-forming bone marrow cells, and they're also surrounded by adipocytes, adipose tissue. Okay, so you'll actually, when you look at spongy bone, see 3 tissues for the price of 1. You'll see a reticular tissue containing the blood-forming red bone marrow. You'll see some adipose tissue, and you'll see the spongy tissue itself, which is organized into these spikes called trabeculae. Okay. If you look carefully, you'll notice that the trabeculae also have little lacunae with osteocytes in them. Okay. So that's the supportive tissues. Finally, the fluid tissues. There are 2 fluid tissues in our body, blood and lymph. Okay. Blood is by far the more interesting of the tissues. Lymph is just a lot of fluid with an occasional cell called a lymphocyte. Okay. Blood has a large collection of these red blood cells, which look kind of like pink jelly donuts. Okay. I'm going to abbreviate that RBC for red blood cell. Okay. It also has, on occasion, some cells with funky nuclei and maybe some little speckles inside them. Those are your white blood cells. Why are they not actually white? Because we've stained the tissue with some other some kind of tissue stain. And then finally, there are these occasional little specks that look like a cell blew up and left some fragments everywhere, and those are platelets. Okay, so now you get the idea of the 12, there are actually 13 if you count lymph, but we're not studying lymph in this unit, so really 12 connective tissues, and hopefully you can see some of the patterns between them, and also be able to look at them under the microscope and make better sketches than I have here, and be able to recognize the different types of tissue. Okay. This should get you ready to do your microscopy lab. Good luck, and see you in class.